stop being selfish. Your sister's twins need a bigger yard, Dad said, standing in my backyard with a realtor. We're listing it next week. You'll stay in the garage apartment. My brother-in-law Kevin laughed like a man hearing good news. He scanned my patio as if he were already mentally rearranging the furniture. The realtor avoided my eyes, her clipboard scratching rhythmically as she took notes. My daughter, Eliza, stood on the back step. She clutched a paper snowflake, her small fingers trembling against the cold glass. Teresa's twins circled the patio on balance bikes, their tires grinding through Eliza's fresh chalk drawings. They didn't apologize as the vibrant yellow suns smeared into gray streaks under their weight. My sister watched them with a tight, expectant smile that didn't reach her eyes. Dad didn't look at me once. He pointed toward the swing set my husband had built before the accident. To him, this wasn't a home. It was just an asset to be redistributed. My hands went cold despite the humid afternoon heat. I stayed silent because the family had trained me to be the fixer. I was the wallet they opened whenever property taxes loomed or fertility treatments drained their accounts. I looked at Eliza, expecting tears. Instead, she slowly folded her paper snowflake in half. She pressed it against her chest, as if she were trying to make herself smaller. She was learning that her space was conditional. It was a lesson I had spent 38 years trying to unlearn. That realization felt like a thumb pressing into a fresh bruise. After they left, the house felt heavy and unfamiliar. I started packing quietly, pulling boxes from the garage apartment. Dad had assigned me like a punishment. I filled one with Eliza's books, and another with her framed school photo. She sat on the rug, watching me tape the cardboard shut with clinical precision. Her stuffed rabbit was tucked under her arm, like a silent witness. "Are we getting kicked out?" she asked softly. I didn't lie to her. We were moving because we weren't wanted. She nodded and began packing her own backpack. That night, my phone buzzed on the granite counter at exactly 10:40 p.m. It was an unknown number with no profile picture. The message was 3 short lines that made my pulse thud in my ears. "Don't leave. Check the basement, Grandma." My heart hammered against my ribs. Grandma Ruth lived in assisted living and hated technology. She said phones were for whispering through walls. This message was urgent and hidden. I grabbed the heavy flashlight from the kitchen drawer. The screen went dark, but the light stayed etched in my vision. The basement smelled of concrete and old paint. I moved toward the back wall, near the freezer Dad insisted stay plugged in. I noticed a seam in the wood paneling that didn't align with the studs. My fingers slipped into the gap and pulled. A narrow cavity revealed a cold metal lockbox and a thick envelope wrapped in plastic. My name, Flora, was written across the front in Grandma's careful, sharp cursive. I realized then that my father wasn't just greedy. He was hiding a crime that was about to cost him everything. I sat at the kitchen table and broke the wax seal. Grandma Ruth did not waste words on the yellowed stationery. She explained that my father had tried to seize the house while she was still breathing. "I am sorry," she wrote in sharp ink. "The house is yours." I checked the trust amendment beneath the letter. It was official and stamped. Dad had stood in my yard selling a property that no longer belonged to his name. The lockbox was even worse than the lies. I found bank statements and handwritten ledgers detailing every cent Dad had stolen. He had drained Grandma's savings to fund Teresa's lifestyle and cover his own mounting debts. Thousands of dollars vanished into accounts I recognized. Each withdrawal matched a time when I was told to pay the family bills. My mouth went dry. They weren't just entitled. They were desperate criminals who viewed me as their final payday. The sun rose on a quiet house. I called the attorney listed in Grandma's files before making coffee. He answered quickly, his voice flat and professional. He confirmed that Dad's power of attorney had been revoked months ago. The house was legally mine. I felt a strange lightness in my chest. I wasn't the guest anymore. I was the landlord. I watched Eliza eat her cereal. She looked at the boxes with a hollow, fearful expression. "We aren't moving." "Ellie," I said softly. Her spoon froze halfway to her mouth. I explained that her room was still hers. She didn't cheer. She simply exhaled a long breath she had been holding since yesterday. I went to my computer and began the clinical work of war. I changed passwords and removed Dad from my accounts. I revoked the linked credit cards one by one. I felt like a surgeon cutting out a rot. At 2 o'clock, the familiar sound of Dad's truck rumbled in the driveway. Teresa and Kevin followed him up the porch steps like a pack of wolves. They didn't knock. Dad tried the handle, but it was locked for the first time in years. He pounded on the wood with his fist. "Open up, Flora," he yelled. "The realtor is coming for photos in 10 minutes. I stood behind the glass, clutching the legal folder. I opened the door only a few inches. "The house isn't for sale," I said. My voice was steady. Dad laughed, a harsh sound that made Eliza flinch behind me. He told me I was being hysterical and selfish again. I held up the trust amendment against the glass. His face shifted from arrogance to a pale, sickly gray. He recognized the signature. He knew the game was over. Teresa started to scream about her children. "I am the trustee now," I told them. "None of you are welcome on this property." Kevin tried to wedge his boot in the doorframe. I didn't flinch. I told him I would call the police for trespassing. They looked at me like I was a stranger. They were right. I was no longer the daughter who paid for her own abuse. I slammed the door and turned the bolt. The silence inside was finally mine. The yelling on the porch continued for an hour before the street went silent. I watched through the blinds as Dad's truck peeled away, leaving deep ruts in the gravel. My phone began to vibrate with a frantic rhythm. Teresa sent a stream of texts accusing me of cruelty toward her boys. I didn't reply to any of them. I simply blocked their numbers. I felt a cold stone of certainty settle in my gut. The next morning, I drove to the assisted living facility to see Grandma Ruth. The air smelled of lavender and antiseptic floor wax. She sat in the common room with a crochet needle in her hand. She didn't look surprised to see me clutching the blue folder. She smiled, her eyes sharp behind thick lenses. She told me she had been waiting for the fallout. She knew her son was a thief. She just needed me to see it. "He came here yesterday," Grandma whispered. She stopped her work and looked at my face. He had tried to charm the staff into giving him her new medical records. She had stood up and told him to leave in front of the other residents. She called him a parasite. I felt a wave of pride wash over me. For years, we had both played the role of the quiet victim. That era ended with one signature. I spent the afternoon at my office, but I couldn't focus on engineering schematics. My boss called me into his room at 4 o'clock. He looked concerned and mentioned that a man was making a scene in the lobby. It was Dad. He was demanding to speak to the payroll department. He claimed I owed him money for family debts. Security was already moving him toward the exit. I felt the heat of humiliation crawl up my neck. When I got home, the locks were still intact, but the backyard was a mess. Someone had torn down the swing set. The wooden beams lay scattered like broken bones across the grass. Eliza stood by the window, her face pale. She wasn't crying anymore. She just looked tired. I realized then that a legal victory wasn't enough to heal the damage. They were going to burn everything down if they couldn't own it themselves. I sat on the floor with Eliza, and we began to plan our own holiday. We ignored the calls from our mother, who cried about family unity. She never mentioned the stolen money or the empty yard. To her, the only sin was my refusal to comply. We decorated a small tree in the corner of the living room. Eliza hung her paper snowflake on a top branch. It was crooked, but it was safe. It stayed. The final blow came on Christmas Eve. A courier delivered a legal notice to my door. Dad was suing to contest the trust, claiming Grandma was of unsound mind. He was trying to drag the woman who saved us into a public court battle. I looked at the signature on the bottom of the page. It wasn't just Dad. Teresa had signed as a witness. They were willing to destroy Grandma to get the house. I stared at the legal notice until the words blurred into ink stains. My father was weaponizing Grandma's age against her own agency. I didn't panic this time. I called the attorney and authorized a forensic audit of the stolen funds. If they wanted a court battle, I would give them a criminal trial instead. I felt a cold iron resolve take over my heart. They had mistaken my previous silence for a permanent lack of teeth. The audit results arrived 2 days later in a thick digital file. The numbers told a story of systematic greed that spanned nearly 5 years. My father had not only taken cash, but had forged Grandma's initials on several high-value checks. He was using her life savings to float a lifestyle he could never afford. I realized that the house sale was his only way to hide the massive hole in the accounts. He was drowning. Christmas morning arrived with a thin layer of frost on the windows. Eliza woke up early and dragged her sketchbook to the kitchen table. She didn't ask about the family or the missing swing set outside. She drew a picture of our house with a tall fence made of flowers. I watched her work and realized she was finally reclaiming her sense of safety. The house felt warm and quiet. The chaos stayed on the other side. Grandma Ruth arrived by taxi at noon, clutching her walker with steady hands. She refused to let the lawsuit dampen her spirit or her appetite. We sat by the fire and shared a meal that didn't feel like a transaction. For the first time, Eliza laughed without checking the door for intruders. We were a family defined by choice rather than blood or debt. The peace was fragile, but it was real and ours. The phone rang during dessert, but I didn't reach for the receiver. The voicemail picked up and Dad's voice filled the room with static. He sounded desperate and small. A far cry from the man in the backyard. He begged me to drop the audit before the bank got involved. He claimed Teresa was losing her rental and had nowhere to go. I deleted the message before he could finish. His urgency was no longer my problem. We spent the afternoon planting a small maple tree where the swing set used to be. The earth was cold, but the roots were deep and strong. Eliza helped me pack the dirt around the base of the trunk. "This one stays," she whispered, her eyes bright with a new kind of certainty. I promised her that nothing would move us again. We were done being guests in our own lives. The soil felt solid. As the sun set, a final email notification appeared on my dimmed screen. It was from the bank's fraud department regarding the suspicious withdrawals I had flagged. They had found a second hidden account linked to my father's name. It contained the remaining balance of my husband's life. Insurance payout from 2 years ago. My breath hitched in my throat. He hadn't just stolen from Grandma. He had stolen from my dead husband. The discovery of the stolen insurance money felt like a physical blow to my chest. My husband had left that fund to ensure Eliza's future in education. I sat in the dim light of the kitchen as the digital records scrolled past my eyes. My father had siphoned the entire amount into a shell company just weeks after the funeral, while I was still grieving. He had watched me struggle with grief while he calculated the value of my loss. The betrayal was finally complete and absolute. I spent the next morning at the police station filing a formal report for grand larceny. The fluorescent lights were cold and humming as I handed over the bank statements. The detective looked at the forged signatures and shook his head slowly. He told me that this level of theft usually carried a mandatory prison sentence. I didn't feel any hesitation or guilt as I signed the final complaint. My father was no longer a parent. He was a common criminal. Teresa arrived at my front door, just as I returned from the station. She looked disheveled and frantic, her eyes darting toward the new maple tree in the yard. She didn't ask about Grandma or Eliza's well-being. She only wanted to know if I had triggered the bank's fraud investigation. I realized she was likely an accomplice in the second account. She had traded her niece's future for a bigger house and new cars. I saw the truth in her trembling. "You have to stop this." "Flora," she hissed through the screen door. I stood my ground and refused to let her inside the house. I told her that the police already had the files and the forged checks. Her face turned a sickly shade of white as the reality of the situation hit her. She wasn't just losing a house, she was facing a felony charge. She stepped back as if I had struck her. The entitlement was finally dying. I didn't argue with her or explain my reasons for the 100th time. I simply told her to find a lawyer before the warrant was issued. She fled to her car, nearly hitting the curb in her haste to escape. I went inside and found Eliza drawing at the table. She looked up and asked if the loud people were gone for good. I knelt beside her and promised that no one would ever yell at us again. I meant it. The bank called an hour later to confirm. They were freezing all accounts linked to the fraud. My father was now broke and legally cornered with nowhere left to run. I felt a strange sense of exhaustion settle into my bones. The fight was almost over, but the cost had been the destruction of my entire origin story. I looked at the paper snowflake on the tree. It was the only family legacy I cared to keep. The house was quiet. That evening, a silver sedan I didn't recognize pulled into the driveway. A man in a dark suit stepped out and adjusted his glasses while checking his phone. He didn't look like a lawyer or a relative. He walked up to the porch and handed me a thick manila envelope. "Your husband had a second policy," he said quietly. "He told us to wait until you found the first theft." I stared at the sealed document in shock. I walked back into the kitchen and sat beneath the dim light of the chandelier. Inside the envelope was a detailed letter from my husband and a secondary life insurance policy that had remained hidden from all public records. He had specifically instructed the firm to release these funds only if the primary accounts were ever tampered with or drained. He knew my father would eventually discover the existence of the first policy. He knew I would be too blinded by loyalty to notice the theft until it was far too late. The letter was a map of a love that saw the world clearly. He urged me to use this second fund to buy my absolute freedom from the Moroccan name. My eyes blurred as I realized he had been guarding me even from the grave. I wasn't just a widow. I was the architect of a new life he had already financed. I looked at the totals on the documents and realized the amount was staggering. It was enough to move Eliza anywhere in the world. I felt the last anchor of guilt snap. The next morning, the police arrived at my father's house to execute the arrest warrants. I didn't go to watch, but Grandma Ruth called me with the details. She had been sitting on her balcony at the facility when she saw the patrol cars speed past toward the family estate. Dad was taken out in handcuffs while the neighbors watched from their lawns. Teresa was also detained for questioning regarding her signature on the forged documents. The empire of lies was finally crumbling into the dirt. It felt like a fever was breaking. I spent the afternoon at the bank with my attorney, moving the new funds into a private trust. No one else had access to this money, not even Grandma, though I ensured her care was paid for life. The banker looked at the scale of the assets and treated me with a newfound, cold respect. I realized that money was the only language my father ever understood. Now that I spoke it better than him, he had become utterly powerless. I felt a strange, hollow victory. It was quiet. When I returned home, I found Kevin sitting on my porch steps. He looked older, his face lined with a desperation that made him look like a cornered animal. He didn't laugh this time. He begged me to bail Teresa out so she could be with the twins. He claimed the children were crying and didn't understand why their mother wasn't home. I looked at him and felt nothing but a distant, clinical pity. He had stood by while they tried to erase my daughter. I didn't owe him a word. "You should have thought about the children before you helped them steal," I said. My voice didn't shake. Kevin stood up, his fists clenching at his sides as if he might strike me. I pointed to the security camera I had installed above the door. He froze, realizing that even his rage was being recorded for a future court date. He turned and walked away without looking back. He was a coward who only preyed on the soft. I went inside and locked the door. It felt final. Eliza was in the backyard, standing near the new maple tree. She was holding a small shovel and a bag of bird seed. She was trying to invite the birds back to the space where the swing set used to be. I watched her through the glass, noting how much taller she seemed today. She wasn't hiding in her room or making herself small anymore. She was claiming the earth under her feet. I joined her outside and felt the cold air fill my lungs. We were finally safe. We spent the evening talking about the future. I asked her where she wanted to go for the summer, now that we had the means to travel. She didn't choose a theme park or a beach. She pointed to the old shed at the edge of the property. She wanted to turn it into an art studio for her drawings. I agreed immediately. As we walked back toward the house, I noticed a black car idling at the end of the street. It didn't belong to the police or the neighbors. The black car remained stationary at the curb, its headlights dark like unseeing eyes. I ushered Eliza inside and locked the door with a sharp click. My heart raced as I peered through the narrow blinds of the living room. The driver didn't move or exit the vehicle. I felt a cold prickle of unease on my neck. This wasn't the police or a relative looking for a handout. It felt deliberate and predatory. I picked up my phone to call the private fiduciary who had visited earlier. The man answered on the first ring. I described the car and the lingering sense of being watched. He told me to stay away from the windows and wait. He explained that my husband's second policy had triggered an automatic security protocol. Apparently, there were individuals who had been monitoring my father's shell company for months. They weren't just creditors. They were part of a larger investigation into a local real estate scam. My father had entangled himself with dangerous people. I realized the threat was no longer just family. 10 minutes later, the black car finally pulled away from the curb. It was replaced by a marked patrol vehicle that parked directly in front of my driveway. The officer didn't approach the house, but his presence provided a thin layer of comfort. I sat on the sofa with a glass of water, trying to stop my hands from shaking. Eliza was already upstairs, blissfully unaware of the new shadow. I looked at the legal folder on the table. The paper seemed to glow under the lamp. The next morning, my attorney arrived with a stack of non-disclosure agreements. He explained that the second insurance policy came with a specific legal shield. My husband had anticipated that my father's debts would attract professional debt collectors. The trust was structured to be invisible to anyone searching for assets under the Marroquin family name. I was effectively a ghost in the financial world. It was a brilliant, cold strategy designed for total protection. I signed every page without hesitation. I wanted to disappear from their world forever. The ink felt like armor. I spent the afternoon at the assisted living facility with Grandma Ruth. We sat in the garden near the fountain. She looked frail, but her spirit was like flint. She told me that Teresa had been released on bail, but was forbidden from contacting us. Dad remained in custody because he couldn't afford the bond. His assets were frozen and his reputation was in tatters. Grandma squeezed my hand with surprising strength. She told me to take Eliza and leave the city for a while. Go to the coast, she whispered. She reminded me of a small cottage her sister once owned. It was far from the reach of the Moroccan name and its failures. I realized she was giving me permission to stop being the family fixer. I didn't need to stay and watch the wreckage of their lives. My only responsibility was the child waiting for me at home. I felt the weight of the house lift from my shoulders. It was time to stop being a target. I agreed. When I returned home, I began packing a suitcase for a long trip. I didn't take much, just clothes and Eliza's art supplies. The house felt different now, like a shell I had outgrown. I planned to put the property into a rental trust for Grandma's benefit. We wouldn't live here anymore, but it would remain a sanctuary for the woman who saved us. Eliza watched me pack with a curious expression. She didn't ask if we were being kicked out this time. She knew. We left just as the sun began to set over the horizon. I looked in the rearview mirror as the neighborhood faded into the distance. The police car was gone and the street was empty. I felt a sudden, sharp burst of joy in my chest. We were driving toward a horizon that wasn't dictated by blood or debt. Eliza was humming a soft tune in the back seat. She was drawing a picture of the ocean. It was the first time she used blue ink. The drive was long and quiet. We reached the coast by midnight and found the cottage Grandma had described. It was a small, weathered building perched on a cliff overlooking the Atlantic. The air was salty and cold, biting at my skin in a way that felt honest. I carried a sleeping Eliza inside and tucked her into a bed that smelled of cedar. I stood on the porch and listened to the waves crashing against the rocks. The sound was immense and permanent. I breathed. I checked my phone one last time before going to sleep. There was a final message from the attorney. He confirmed that the forensic audit had uncovered a secret account in my mother's name as well. She hadn't been a silent victim. She was the one who suggested the insurance theft. The realization hit